Welcome to Tracing Your Family Roots. My name is Arlene Sachs. This is Sally Ann Sachs. And today we're going to do something we haven't done before, and that's look at a book and spend the morning looking at this book, which is called The Source. The first edition came out over 20 years ago, 1984, and this is the third edition. And for anybody doing genealogy work in the United States, it's absolutely fantastic.
Let me just say here, named the American Library Association's best reference for its first edition back in 1984, and then this professor of history at California State says this invaluable work is essential for any genealogy course. It is, if you have to buy only one book,
that's it,
and you live in the United States, I must say, we have to say this is American genealogy.
Particularly United States. I mean,
right.
Not even Canada or Mexico.
Right, it's
U.S.
U.S. genealogy, good point. And it is the essential book for that.
Yeah, there's many things in here, of course, that we have talked about over the years. The first chapter begins with the general basics, how to interview and what documents you want to look for and so on. And then it goes on to the new thing, of course, is all of the things that you can do in the web.
Well, see, what we did with this book is that you and I have looked at it and said, what have we not talked about on this show that we've had on for 10 years? What topics do they cover? And what I like about, I must say that the two women who've written it, Lou Sukes and Sandra Lubitkin, are leaders in American genealogy. And what they say is that what you're doing in genealogy is you are writing mini biographies for every person on your tree. And then they sort of, their approach says, okay, what kind of documents can possibly exist that will locate a particular relative in a particular place at a particular time? And that's the approach that guides, I think, the whole selection of what's in the book.
And they've divided it up very well. And let's look at one of the chapters deals with records and some of the things that we didn't even know existed.
I love this.
A list of tolls paid by covered wagons going over the Barlow Road in Oregon. I mean, who could imagine something like that? And they had to pay from $5 to $25.
$25 was a fortune.
I mean, $5 was a fortune 150 years ago.
You read about this kind of stuff in Europe where they had tolls on roads. If I would bet you, if we asked any Americans, kids, adults, anybody, whether we ever had, well, we have toll roads. What's the road going out to Dulles, for crying out loud, airport? So this was a toll road for covered wagons.
Well, I've heard of toll roads, but it seems to me that $5 to $25
or no, the fact that the guy kept a record.
Yes, and they kept a record of everybody going through, and
but that says something that I want to highlight if I can. They found that book in a collection that was in the Oregon Historical Society's archives, and I think the one thing, maybe one of the things we have not emphasized so much is that after you do the big stuff like census and other things like that, and you have to get down to the local community, if you're still struggling, go to the Historical Society. They are absolutely the best. They've got such
gems that you can't imagine anybody else would have.
Well, can you believe that Historical Societies helped me find every single place any Jew was ever buried in the state of Louisiana?
Wow.
I mean, places you wouldn't know, but they knew. Okay.
Other things like bankruptcy records we haven't discussed at all, but that makes sense too, because that would be would be in the courts and so on.
But there's a lot to be learned from them. Just this week, a friend of mine got some through the National Archives, by the way. That's where he got the art. And they have great information because it lists all the family members. And then there was people in the family fighting each other, and then you had their relationships, on and on. Really good.
Apprenticeship records, labor union records. These are things that we haven't touched. Railroad employees records, poorhouse records. I thought that was interesting too.
Yeah, I've never
and the CCC.
What's a CCC?
That was in the 1930s.
Something conservation course?
Yeah, yes, the conservation course records. Okay. And the Social Security
records are key. Insurance records. And do they list hospital records? Those also. Insurance company records and hospital records can be, and coroner records.
Well, we've talked about those because we're familiar with those because we did the funeral home records locally, and we were indexing.
Funeral homes are one thing, coroners are another thing. cause of death.
Yeah.
And was there, you know, an autopsy?
Yes, but the coroner is only involved when there's some question.
Right.
This one has surprised both of us. The Jewish Foundation for the Education of Women of the Lower East Side. Now, here's a Jewish organization that we never heard of.
And that was look how long they were in existence.
From 1880 to 1988. And they gave scholarships after 1932, something we never heard of.
Well, but yes, what it reminds me of is that it's very, it would be true for any ethnic group, or it's certainly for Jews, the local Jewish records, Jewish societies, Jewish organizations, there were a multitude, the free loan societies, the burial societies, all other kinds of societies. And so, and where are those records today, and what can you, because they would locate somebody in a particular location at a particular time. And from there, you can go further.
They would either be, my guess would be to look in the Jewish historical societies, which every state has in a locality, most localities.
When you go, actually, when you go to the South, as I did, as I've been doing for this book that I'm still working on, it's in the small towns. Don't forget, the other thing is, don't forget to place your ancestor in historical context.
So it'd be just the general historical.
Not all Jews lived in New York City. Lots of them were peddlers in little towns. So you have small town records.
Okay, the census records we've talked about, church records. The interesting thing about the book in the census records is that it tells you where to write for individual state records, where to look for them.
And for example, we all know that there's no 1890 census. But do you know what that New York State had a census in 1892? I didn't know that until I just looked. I knew about the 1905 and 1915, but 1892 is very close. And I've read that they took these censuses after the loss of the 1890.
Oh, okay.
In part.
Marriage, church records, we've talked about some.
What are evangelical records? I have no idea what they are. Do you?
Not really. It could be the evangelical church. It could be, I don't really know what they were after there. Sheriff records, court records. We've talked about federal and territorial, civil records such as divorce records and so on.
And at our genealogy conference this summer, there were two, and we had one show on this, two presentations on criminal records. And I think they have in there a list of prisons, and if you had heard that a relative of yours was in prison, you could get the prison records.
Yeah.
Well,
we did one show on it too.
Right. But they list all the prisons and the addresses. The interesting thing, even if they're high tech, and they are in this book, they also remind you that there are certain basics that you go back to.
Not every person's going to put a list of their former prisoners on the web, so you need to write to these places. The historical societies too. You don't have every paper on the web. There's a lot more to. The web is fantastic, but there's more to do than that.
Oh, way more.
They have a marvelous coverage of the Stephen Morse web page, which allows you to research other web pages more easily. We've talked about that and did a show on that here, and they have a very, very good coverage on that.
That reminds me, there's a new website called footnote.com that I see here the immigration and the naturalization, but I'm going to skip down. Mostly they're good for military records. They're a new group. They just started in January this year. They are doing images of records at the U.S. National Archives. And not just indexes of names, but the whole record, the image of the record. And they're concentrating first on military records, Revolution, Civil War, and World War II.
The image portion is so very important because so often when things are indexed, they're indexed wrong.
Oh,
and if you get a chance to really look at the image, you might say, oh, this is not really the name I was looking for at all. They just wrote it wrong.
Absolutely.
One of the things about the military records, when I was giving a class locally here, one woman said, I know my grandmother received a pension for her husband who fought in the Civil War. How would I write, and she was in Florida, how would I go about finding something like that? So off the top of my head, I said, well, I guess I would write to the Historical Society in Florida. Well, my husband Sid was there. And he walked over to one of the computers, and about 2 minutes later, he found an 8-page application for pension online from Florida. And the originals had been photographed, so you could see her handwriting and everything in it. And it was at the FloridaMemory.com collections/pension files. I mean, he didn't know that.
But the National Archives has all these pension records too.
But I mean,
he
got it within 2 minutes after being asked. I couldn't believe how fast it was.
But that's reminding me, which I don't know if they talk about in the book. I have decided that the way I learned to do research when I was doing my doctoral dissertation is out the door.
Oh, yeah.
What you really need to know how to do is how to search the web. I've heard more things about people who couldn't find somebody on the Hamburg immigration or Ellis Island, and somebody clever said, well, don't search that way, just put in this parameter,
and it comes out.
So well, you have to learn. I mean, your husband obviously learned how to do this.
Well, he certainly didn't know to go to FloridaMemory.com/collection/prison files.
No.
He did, whether it was a Google search or something on pension records from Florida, and it came up with it. So, yes, it's
learning how to
manipulate.
The internet is, I think, really important.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not the basic. You still have to go to the original documents.
Yes.
And not trust just indexes.
But the neat thing is that more and more places are putting, like this, had the whole document there.
Right.
Which is certainly, it's something I would never in a million years have expected. Why would they put that on the web?
I know.
But thank goodness they did.
Yeah, it's great. It's so good.
They have a really good chapter on newspapers, on obituaries, the New York Times, local papers. They have lists of papers by state, newspapers by state, so that you could go to the state that you're interested in, look for the newspapers. They have lists of ethnic newspapers, and this is the only little flaw that I found in the book. I don't want to criticize it, but there are 2 Jewish newspapers that I would certainly have put among the ethnic newspapers, and one is the Forward's,
which was the Eastern European newspaper. Now it's in English, but it was in Yiddish.
Since about I'm guessing about 1882 is when
maybe not quite that early, but certainly by 1900. My grandfather found his sister in the Bintel briefs there.
And that's a very famous. There's a book called the Bintel
briefs. It was I'm looking for it. Yeah.
And the other book, the other magazine newspaper is the Aufbau, and that was post World War II.
German.
In German, and it's mainly for German survivors to find each other, and it has marriage, death records, obituaries, everything. And I know my family, subscribe to that,
and no question, that's one of the key sources for the society pages of Jewish newspapers, of Polish newspapers. So-and-so's sister was visiting from such and such. Well, there you have it, all kinds of genealogy. So the newspapers are very important, and they list a great deal.
Yes, as I said, these are the only 2 that the only 2 that I knew of that were not listed. And it's several pages of lists of these ethnic newspapers. So if you know where your ancestors came from, that's a good place to start looking for them. Vital records we've talked about to a great extent. Finding aids and how to use finding aids and indexes and so on. They have several chapters on things that we've not covered at all. And one of them is the African-American Researcher.
You said there was 30 pages?
30 pages. I mean, this is a big, fat book, but still 30 pages on one topic is a lot.
Well, I know in D.C. there is an African-American Genealogy Society that's very active.
And there's one down in Loudoun County. I had her on the show.
Well, I would assume it's the same thing as why you need Jewish genealogy societies. The history of the groups is such that it shapes the kinds of approaches you have to take to the research.
And interestingly, if I remember one time being in one of the Mormon church libraries, and a black woman said, I found my ancestor. And of course, they didn't have names, last names to a certain extent, so they face a lot of similar types of problems that we do.
I have to just say, only in a Mormon library, when somebody says, I found it, everybody claps. No librarian comes over and says, that's so much fun.
Everybody gets excited when you find something like that. Another thing that this book does is has a chapter on colonial English research. So we're going back in American history quite far, and it lists all the 13 colonies and where to find the materials for those.
But the thing I didn't know is they have colonial Spanish. And that I did know this part, that they refer you at some point to records in France. If your ancestors came to Louisiana, they had these emigration records.
Louisiana and Quebec.
So they include Quebec, even though it's Canada.
Yeah, but
and I know also that.
What do you want to say the name of that?
Oh, Le Centre des Archives d'Outre-mer, Overseas Archives.
Overseas Archives in Provence.
In Provence, for
and
Florida.
It's for Florida. And there's also archives in Cuba and in Mexico that contain material that is now for the United States, or what, Florida.
But people coming, yes. And so they have a short section on Spanish nobility.
Yeah, under the Hispanic search, which I thought was interesting too, because somehow we think of that only as going to Mexico, but obviously it came into
right.
the U.S. too. There's a section on Jewish American research, and that's by our friend Gary Mogotov. We're not going to need to talk about that right here. And they have a very large chapter on Native Americans, the American Indians, and it's information by the nation, and where the various nations lived in Oklahoma, say, or where they lived, and it's a very large chapter.
How far back those records go?
I don't think the Indians ever had records as such.
But I wonder if it's similar to the Ethiopian Jews. The Ethiopian Jews did not, remember we had that show on, they didn't have written records, but they knew their genealogies, they were passed down orally, and children were taught them.
Yeah.
And so there were people in the community that kept the records and knew. I just have to tell you a story. It's not in this book, but the Spanish makes me think of it, and it just came up today, and it gives you a flavor for this. This week is the Jewish New Year, and we have a prayer that we say. It's a long prayer. One line is, "Who shall live and who shall die," and it goes on and on. I learned this week about a woman in Shepherdstown, West Virginia, where Shepherd College is. She's from Mexico, from a small town in Mexico. She's Catholic. I think her husband's
Mexico or New Mexico?
Mexico.
Okay.
Her husband's on the faculty. She's become very friendly with an Israeli woman who's also associated with the faculty, and because of her, went to synagogue with her, where she heard this prayer. And this woman freaked out. There's no other word, because when she was 13 years old, living in Mexico, the oldest daughter in the family, her grandmother took her aside and taught her this prayer. In Hebrew.
Oh, in Hebrew.
In Hebrew. She didn't know it was Hebrew. And said it is a family prayer, and we teach it to the oldest daughter.
And what did she explain about the language?
Nothing. Just
you have to memorize these words.
That's right. I don't know it in Hebrew.
Yeah.
But can you believe? Talk about records. It's just so. There's this. So now she's very interested in tracing further back.
It's like so people are coming out of the woodwork and finding the Jewish ancestor, like the Sonia Rosa show, which is one of the best shows that
right. But you see, when you get these records, now she'll know where to look for some records.
This is, again, I want to say we're talking today mostly about the source. And this is...
And it's published by Ancestry.com. One of the editors is executive vice president, I think, of the source of Ancestry.
And it's really the book to use if you're going to do American genealogy.
Did you say that every library in Fairfax County has two copies?
Every library in Fairfax County has 2 copies. One that's on the reference shelf, and one that you can take out.
One circulates.
So, in fact, that's this little piece of paper here from Fairfax County Library. So that's how important a book it is. And if every library, even the little ones, have 2 copies, that shows the importance of something like this.
Avotine was often asked, I want to start a genealogy library, what should I buy? Truly, if you live in the United States, this is the #1 book. I have nothing but admiration for people who can do revised editions of things, of guidebooks. It's just a chore. But they've updated it with all this new internet technology stuff.
They've done a very, very good job on the internet, like Stephen Morse's site. They go into very detailed, and he has, follow the blue or follow the red, and they go through that exactly and say what you should do for each one, and if your situation is this, then follow that.
Well, see, the point is, it really is a guidebook.
Yeah.
It tells you step by step how to do it, whereas you could get lost in this massive material, but it's so well organized.
Okay. It's got very good indexes. It's got.
Was this the book where you first found the German handwriting?
Yes, it was. That's no longer in this book, but it was something maybe 20 years ago when they began. I swear that it was a little tiny thing about 2 inches by 3 inches and it had the German letters and the American equivalent. And I used to sit with that and try to figure out how to read the old letters. Now that's taken out of here. Now that's not in here anymore because you can find that so many other places.
The other thing that we haven't focused on is some of the earlier American history, Civil War history, and things associated with the Land Act, land grants, all that kind of stuff that was going on when our ancestors were still back in Europe. We haven't really focused, but for Americans whose families were here in the 1900s, in the 1800s, 19th century,
17 and 1800s.
This is has everything you really
need
to know.
And especially when our founding fathers of 1700s, the colonial Spanish and the early English settlers.
And I'm told by, we think that we have a hard time doing genealogy. I'm told that some of this early U.S. history, U.S. genealogy is extremely hard to do because this was a country where people came to get lost.
That's right.
They didn't write so much. The records were, where were you from? Bavaria.
Well, I mean, how often do we see that in our own Jewish genealogy, where they left because they were persecuted and they gave whatever age suited them is what they said. They didn't believe, they were afraid of giving information.
And again, this week somebody told me that he was looking for an ancestor's record. They came on a totally different name. They didn't use the name Epstein. They used the name Shatton. Okay, now how do you find them? That's a whole great story. We're gonna
how did you find out that they used a different name?
Well, you'll read the next issue of Avotana and you'll find out. But learning how, that's one of the ones where how to do research on the internet cleverly. He knew the names of all the children. He did an Ellis Island search with the first names and the ages, and the family just popped right up. Yes, and he knew who that name was a family name, so he understood that it was his name.
My guess is that somehow someone got permission to leave the country, and that's how they had to leave, or something like that.
No, what happened was that the Shattons had bought the tickets here in the U.S. and mailed them over, so apparently the tickets were in that name. So they sailed in that name. So I mean, we couldn't get away with that now. But
again, let's say our website is tracingroots.nova.org, and I hope our audience.
One of the things.
Wait, let me finish with this. Look at our tracingroots.nova.org. If you see any show on there, well, anyway,
what were you going to say?
I was going to say something that if they see any show that they're interested in, to let us know.
Right, exactly. Because that's what this also. What this has helped us recognize is that there are some gaps in what we haven't covered.
Yes,
that would be very important for people who
I think we've done a lot more foreign types of research because our ancestors
came later to the United States.
So that anybody that's been here a couple of 100 years or even 100 years, this is good.
Yes, much more important.
Another thing, I don't think we mentioned the Homestead Act.
Well, that's that land stuff.
Land
grants that I don't quite understand.
Well, even in the early, King so-and-so gave Washington a land grant for thousands of acres and things like that. And
actually, I did have some relatives who went out to Montana. They didn't stay. They ended up in Minnesota and in Minneapolis. They just were not good farmers.
Who wants to go out to Montana?
Well, they didn't make it as farmers. They just couldn't do it. So but the other thing, I don't know if they have railroads in there.
Yes, they did mention railroads in there.
Because that often explains why your relative ended up in Sioux City, Iowa. It was the dead end of it was the end of the line. They got off at the end of the line. A bunch of mine did that.
I don't know if they talk about that, but they have railroad records of employees and all sorts of things like that.
The railroads do have archives. I've used the archives of the Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Sioux.
Oh, really?
Way back in the early 80s, I called them up, when it was a simpler time, and they looked up some records for me of relatives of mine.
So they're
Right.
available. It's just a constant, even after all of these years of research, it constantly amazes me of the kind of records that you can find.
Well, see, I think the important thing is, you know, think about your own life. If you think about your daily activities, you belong to organizations, you have certain kinds of jobs, your name is recorded in various places.
But the amazing thing is that these things weren't thrown out afterwards. That's what amazes me.
Yeah, that's true. Well, you just moved, so throwing things out is in your on your mind.
Yeah, but even organizations, the organization goes defunct and you throw it out, nobody cares anymore.
Many times that does happen, unfortunately. But fortunately, there are some things that are saved, like toll payments on the Barlow Road.
But I mean, who would expect
some man saved it. But you know, the late Malcolm Stern used to say that to me. He said, a lot is thrown out. He said, but so much is created that overlaps about a person's life that sooner or later you will pick up the trail.
Yeah.
If you just think in terms of, did they have insurance policies?
Didn't you have well, we don't have time for it, but you had something that you had found on the web where it listed, don't bother looking it up, we only have a few seconds, but where it listed alternate sources for birth records, alternate sources for marriage records.
Right.
So these things are available, so that if you can't find the record, you find
other things. You work around it.
Yeah, like bands, which I don't really understand, but I guess churches had bands, and in Europe
I
they
think
had
they
bands.
were announcements of engagements, maybe?
Something on that order, yeah, and somebody could say, no, they can't get married, or whatever.
Because they're already married.
Yeah.
or some
Well, I hope this helps some people. Okay, well.